Imagine walking down a dark road. At first, everything seems under control. The terrain is familiar. The path is predictable. But little by little, without realizing it, you start to stray. One small step to the side, nothing too serious. Then another and another. Now, you're so far off course that turning back seems impossible. This is the process of self-destruction. It's not a sudden event, but a series of small daily concessions. You don't wake up one day and decide to destroy your life. That's not how it works. Self-destruction happens gradually, in a disguised manner, through decisions postponed, repeated bad habits, and ignored problems. By the time you realize it, it's too late, and you find yourself trapped in a cycle that seems impossible to break. Dostoevsky understood this better than anyone. The Russian writer lived through his own intense personal battles. He was imprisoned in Siberia, faced poverty, addiction, madness, and even death. But more than that, he observed this human reality closely, reflecting on what happens when someone's life is lost, little by little, to wrong choices and destructive impulses. In Dostoevsky's novels, we see characters that are portraits of this gradual ruin. Men who slowly sink deeper into their own choices until they find themselves trapped in a personal hell. One of these characters is Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment. He is a young man who believes he is superior to common morality, someone who can kill without guilt, without facing the consequences. But as the story unfolds, he finds himself increasingly tormented by his own conscience. The justification he finds for his crime is not enough to ease the growing pain inside him. He cannot face the truth about himself, and this denial leads him to madness and suffering. Another example is the underground man from Notes from Underground. This character believes he is extremely intelligent and self-aware, but he is trapped in his own bitterness. He sees the world with cynicism, blaming others for his unhappiness, but does nothing to change his own life. His intelligence, which should set him free, actually traps him further, creating a cycle of suffering and self-sabotage. Dostoevsky understood that human beings don't fear pain or misery as much as they fear self-knowledge. Self-knowledge requires confrontation. It requires facing the painful truths about one's own life and choices. For many, it's easier to live in comfortable deception than in a truth that could be devastating. If you want to follow the path of self-destruction, the first step is simple: avoid self-knowledge. Never question your motivations. Never look within yourself. Believe that you already know yourself well enough. This attitude ensures that your life will be guided by chance, without deep reflection or awareness of your choices. It's a path that, though it may seem harmless at first, slowly distances you from your true essence and your ability to change. This is just the beginning of the path you might follow if you choose self-destruction. And believe me, it's a seductive path. But remember, it's not a big, sudden leap. It's made of small steps, seemingly insignificant, until you find yourself lost. The second step towards self-destruction is even more insidious, because it involves confusing pleasure with happiness. In a world increasingly focused on instant gratification, it's easy to fall into the temptation of seeking immediate pleasure as if it's the key to a fulfilled life. However, as Dostoevsky knew very well, this relentless pursuit of pleasure is a trap that, instead of freeing us, enslaves us. In his novels, Dostoevsky shows how his characters are tragically guided by this fatal mistake. One of the most striking examples is Dmitri Karamazov from the Brothers Karamazov. He is the type of man who lives by impulses, driven by momentary pleasure. He spends money he doesn't have, gets involved in destructive relationships, and seeks intense pleasures with no regard for the consequences. To him, living is feeling, and the more intense the experience, the better. The relentless pursuit of immediate pleasure leads him into a cycle of chaos, despair, and destruction. Dmitri completely ignores the fact that the true meaning of life is not in the frantic pursuit of fleeting pleasures, but in finding lasting purpose. The problem with immediate pleasure is that it's never enough. When you allow yourself to be consumed by it, you begin to realize that the inner emptiness only grows. Dostoevsky understood this deeply. In the Brothers Karamazov, he not only describes the insatiable pursuit of pleasure, but also the devastating effects it has on the human soul. The more one tries to fill the emptiness with fleeting pleasure, whether through parties, addictions, or shallow relationships, the greater the feeling of dissatisfaction grows. On the other hand, true happiness requires construction. It demands that you look beyond immediate gratification and focus on long-term goals, on things that truly have value and meaning. Ignoring purpose and focusing solely on momentary satisfaction is a surefire path to emptiness. Pleasure, no matter how enjoyable for a time, does not fill the human need for meaning. The more you try to satiate this emptiness with ephemeral stimuli, the more dependent you become on them. Dostoevsky knew that suffering doesn't come from the lack of pleasure, but from the lack of purpose. A human being can endure any pain when they understand the reason they are suffering. But when life is reduced to chasing meaningless stimuli, you become a slave to your own dissatisfaction. If you dedicate yourself only to seeking immediate pleasure, ignoring the consequences and the lack of meaning behind your choices, you are condemning your life to an endless cycle of emptiness. This is the easy path, the one most people choose because it requires less effort. However, as Dostoevsky teaches us with the tragic fates of his characters, this choice inevitably leads to ruin. If you want to destroy your own life effectively, keep seeking only momentary pleasure. Ignore the idea of purpose and follow the logic that feeling is the same as living. By doing this, you will ensure that, over time, no pleasure will be enough, and the emptiness you are trying to avoid will become increasingly unbearable. Momentary pleasure will never be a lasting answer to life's challenges. But if you choose to ignore this and continue the relentless pursuit of instant gratification, you will be paving the way to your own destruction. The emptiness you are trying to fill with pleasure will never be filled, and in the end, you'll realize that a life driven by momentary pleasure is an empty and unsustainable existence. The third step on the path to self-destruction is cultivating pride and resentment. This is a winding and dangerous path, but seductive, because it involves the belief that if you are strong, indifferent, and never admit weaknesses, you can avoid pain. However, as Dostoevsky so brilliantly described, this attitude is not a sign of strength, but of fragility. Pride and resentment, far from protecting a person, become invisible chains that imprison them in an existence of endless suffering. If you want to follow the path of self-destruction, the secret is to make pride your guide. Never admit you are wrong, never apologize, and above all, cultivate resentments. Every small offense you receive should be fed until it becomes a great bitterness, something that grows inside you and consumes you. By doing this, you create a life filled with conflict, isolating yourself from others and intensifying your internal anguish. Dostoevsky explores this theme masterfully in the Brothers Karamazov, especially through the character of Ivan Karamazov. Ivan is a brilliant intellectual, but his inability to deal with his own doubts and resentments drives him away from his family and eventually leads him to a mental collapse. His pride in denying the existence of God and his contempt for human emotions are not signs of strength or superiority, but a profound fragility. He avoids facing the weight of his own emotions, and instead of confronting them, he distances himself further from the truth, creating an abyss between him and others. Another powerful example is Pavel Murdyakov, also from the Brothers Karamazov. He is a character marked by resentment. As Karamazov's legitimate son, he harbors bitterness about his social position and the status he feels he doesn't deserve. This resentment turns into silent betrayal and vengeance, ultimately culminating in a crime. Murdyakov represents the depth of unresolved bitterness, which becomes corrosive and self-destructive. Cultivating pride and resentment might seem like a way to protect yourself, to put yourself above others and the situations that hurt you. But the price of this choice is the destruction of all genuine relationships and the loss of peace of mind. By projecting blame onto others and refusing to forgive, you imprison yourself in a vicious cycle of hatred and vengeance. Never feeling capable of being vulnerable, you prevent any true connection from happening. Resentment feeds the idea that you are right and others are wrong. But what this really does is distance you from other people and from yourself. You become incapable of looking at your own flaws and limitations because you prefer to blame others. This doesn't just destroy your relationships, it also undermines your own ability to grow and transform. Life then becomes a battlefield where instead of finding solutions or peace, you only find more conflict and isolation. The trap of pride and resentment is profoundly destructive because it prevents you from looking at yourself honestly. It makes you believe that the solution to your problems is to emotionally isolate yourself, to protect yourself from pain with the hardness of pride. But in reality, this path only leads to internal destruction. By cultivating grudges and feeding your own arrogance, you are only creating more and more barriers between you and the world. This will not bring happiness, connection, or redemption. If you want to destroy your life effectively, keep feeding pride and resentment. Never admit you're wrong, never give in, and never let your vulnerability show. Living this way will ensure that your relationships become unsustainable and that you live in constant anguish, never finding peace or happiness. This is one of the surest paths to total internal collapse and isolation.